Okay, good evening. It is time to finish chapter 9 of this book. So we're on chapter the last third of chapter 9 of the problem of slavery in the age of revolution. Excuse me. It's a very long chapter, so I had to break it up. And that means we've got two more chapters in the epilogue after that. Um, so we're getting there. All right. So, time to settle in, and we've got about 30 pages to finish out this chapter. In 1800 and again in 1804, Wilberforce rejoiced over the news that absentee planters from the older colonies favored suspending the slave trade as a means of curtailing sugar production. Though Wilberforce could not publicly compromise his principles, he was more than willing to settle for suspension and forego personal glory. But to his disappointment, he discovered that too many of the West Indians feared that a suspended trade could never be revived, and the fate of conventional motions for abolition was even more disheartening. In 1804, the Commons approved Wilberforce's abolition measure by a 3-to-1 majority. The following year, as in 1793, the House reversed itself, much to Wilberforce's astonishment. To Pitt, who was once again Prime Minister and who had urged that the question be postponed, Wilberforce confided that the abolitionists could not sustain another such defeat. Success would require experiments in political innovation as well as a redefinition of the role of national interest in colonial policy. When Addington assumed office, a group of investors who had the ear of the new administration began pressing for the sale of rich crown properties in Trinidad and St. Vincent, ostensibly for the purpose of increasing government revenue and of encouraging the clearing and cultivation of new lands. Such a move would have given an enormous impetus to the Atlantic slave trade, which was already converging on the new British markets. Patrick C. Lipscomb has recently shown how George Canning seized upon the Trinidad question, quote, as a means of driving William Pitt into opposition to Addington's government and of creating a new opposition party with Pitt as its leader, end quote. A shrewd and aspiring young politician, Canning had been exasperated by Pitt's support of a weak administration and searched for any opportunity that might bring both Pitt and himself back into office. And though Canning was a genuine abolitionist who had urged Pitt in 1799 to make abolition a government measure, he was also a close friend and ally of Charles Rose Ellis, an absentee planter who represented the interests of the older West Indian colonies. Canning was thus well prepared to engineer a political realignment that would drive a wedge between the traditional planter interests and the speculators who were clamoring for a rapid and uncontrolled development of the newer West Indian territories. Canning saw his chance when Addington casually informed the Commons in November 1801 that the government intended to sell the Crown properties. After much intrigue and political maneuvering, Canning presented his challenge on May 27, 1802. He warned the Commons of the extreme danger of allowing Trinidad to be settled with slaves, a policy that could only give sanction to later demands for unlimited importations from Africa. In an appeal for broad based support, he reminded the House not only of its commitment of 1792, but of the Ellis resolutions of 1797, which had looked to a positive policy of encouraging the natural increase of West Indian or Creole slaves as a means of eliminating the need for African labor. Canning then made a seemingly moderate proposal. He asked that the Crown issue regulations that would suspend the slave trade to Trinidad until Parliament had had time to consider the matter. But he also envisioned a far reaching program of agricultural reform in which Trinidad would become an experimental model for the use of machinery and free labor. Canning failed in his scheme to isolate Addington and to force Pitt into political opposition. Addington simply backed down and promised that the government would make no land grants that might serve as an excuse for continuing the slave trade or for discouraging the growth in Trinidad of a white or Creole population. Yet Canning had succeeded in heading off the possibility of a vastly expanded slave trade stimulated by the unregulated development of Trinidad. He had also discovered a formula for linking abolitionism with the national interest and for weakening the slave trade by closing off its newer and more vulnerable markets. When the war resumed in 1803, Britain swiftly reconquered the uh, Guianan colonies of Demerara, Berbice, Essequibo, and Suriname. I'm sure I butchered those names, sorry. Which had been returned to Holland during the brief interim of peace. James Stephen and Wilberforce's other friends demanded an open debate in Parliament on stopping the importation of slaves into Guyana. Wilberforce demurred, since Pitt, who had become Prime Minister in May 1804, had assured him this trade would be ended by royal proclamation. Henry Brougham, writing secretly from Holland in 1804, told Stephen that the death warrant of the slave trade depended on a mere dash of Pitt's pen, yet it was only when Wilberforce threatened to join opposition leaders in presenting the issue to Parliament that Pitt finally issued an order in council on August 15, 1805, cutting off the supply of slaves to captured territories. This critical measure, which received an enabling order only 4 months before Pitt died, opened the way for parliamentary action prohibiting British ships from supplying slaves to any conquered or foreign markets. The Foreign Slave Trade Bill of 1806 eliminated more than half of the uh, of the total British trade. As Roger Anstey has argued, policy mark, oh, sorry, if policy makers had been swayed by only a narrow conception of national self-interest, they should have been content with this first abolition, quote unquote. In fact, most of the members of the, quote, Ministry of the Talents, end quote, which succeeded Pitt, were personally favorable to total abolition. Lord Grenville, the Prime Minister, privately expressed the wish that the Foreign Slave Trade Bill, quote, may be only a prelude to a much more complete and satisfactory measure, end quote. A measure, one may add, which he himself was soon to secure. Yet it must be stressed that abolition was never a foregone conclusion, notwithstanding ministerial support and the admitted economic weaknesses of West Indian planters, who were complaining by early 1807 that the average price of sugar on the British market seldom equaled the bare cost of production. No administration could easily break free from the precedents of gradualism, which required that commitment be balanced and indefinite with indefinite delay. In order to raise no suspicions, the Whig leaders presented the Foreign Slave Trade Bill as merely a supplement to Pitt's order in council. As a measure founded on sheer expediency, wholly dissociated from abolitionist principles or influence. In actuality, there was a virtual conspiracy between the spring of 1806 beginning in the spring of 1806 between the abolitionists and such government leaders as Grenville, Fox, and Lord Henry Petty. At every point they coordinated strategy, though the abolitionists pretended to be innocent onlookers. It was the knowledgeable Stephen who helped plug loopholes in the foreign slave trade bill and who played at least a part in drafting the final abolition law. When Grenville developed a plan for introducing the abolition bill in the House of Lords, he consulted Wilberforce each step of the way, deferring to the latter's judgment on whether a bill should be simultaneously taken up in the Commons. The reformers took full advantage of surprise, as when Fox moved for a resolution in the Commons late in the 1806 session, and when Grenville introduced the bill in the House of Lords at the very beginning of the 1807 session, in order to provide sufficient time for possible examining of evidence. But despite the parliamentary maneuvering, despite the brilliant stroke of first making sure of the House of Lords, Grenville found it necessary to exploit all the coercive powers of his office. Even so, there was barely time for the bill to win royal assent before the Talents Ministry fell over the issue of granting military commissions to Roman Catholics. Wilberforce had no doubts that a gracious providence had allowed Grenville to redeem the nation, just as he was venturing to put the people's happiness, quote, on a popish foundation, end quote, or that the redemption had cleared the way for Wellington's successes in the Iberian Peninsula. One must not confuse motives with the temporary conditions which make a political act possible. There is no reason to question the idealistic motives that helped bring overwhelming final majorities for abolition. 100 to 34 in the Lords, 283 to 16 in the Commons. It was precisely because abolition had long been defined as a humanitarian ideal that it had appeal for a political coalition determined to achieve at least one striking reform, even if it were too weak to override the king on such issues as Catholic rights. But the ideological meaning of a reform is something more than the sum of the reformers' motives and intentions. It was not accidental that the successful abolition law originated in the House of Lords, or that credit for the humanitarian achievement was soon extended to the king himself, in celebration of the Jubilee year of his reign. The anti-slavery movement had originally attracted radicals like Price, Priestley, Walker, and James Martin. It had won the support of liberal reformers like Romilly, Francis, and Fox. By 1815, however, abolitionists were working closely with Castlereagh, Wellington, and Lord Liverpool. The cause gave Clarkson and Allen friendly access to the Emperor of Russia and allowed the former to address the quote-unquote illustrious potentates at the Congress of Vienna. Wilberforce's fears that the Abolition Act would be repealed by the High Tories proved to be quite unfounded. The law of 1807 was not a response to petitions, to public clamor, or to threatened boycott. Wilberforce published his letter to the freeholders and other inhabitants of Yorkshire because of public ignorance and apathy. The Abolition Committee warned against public meetings or any appearance of organized activity. MPs, they advised, should receive spontaneous applications from private individuals. Yet the abolitionist triumph could be advertised as proof that a virtuous government would ultimately confirm, according to its own wisdom, a cause that had expanded the hearts and excited the generous sympathies of the people. The beauty of the act, according to the Edinburgh Review, was that that the public had pressed the issue upon the government. The abolitionists' success showed that in England a righteous question need only be fully revealed and understood to be carried. On an issue of pure humanity, there could be a mysterious interaction between the government and the governed, implying a unity of sentiment that bypassed questions of representation and consent. For a didactic age, the achievement presented numerous lessons, not in political action, but in what Clarkson termed "quote unquote" practical benevolence. The Bishop of London asserted that from the beginning of the world to this hour of triumph there had never been an act that had exterminated so great a quantity of evil, or that had forwarded so great a quantity of good. The British legislature had obtained nothing less than, quote, a total change in the condition of 1/4 of the habitable globe, end quote. Writing Wilberforce from Bombay, Sir James Mackintosh predicted that hundreds of thousands would be animated by Wilberforce's encouraging example, which had shown that within the short space of 20 years the exertions of virtue may be crowned by splendid success. Quote, how noble and sacred is human nature, made capable of achieving but truly great exploits, end quote. Sorry, I kind of butchered that. Even before success was assured, Clarkson had rapidly been assembling materials for his 2-volume morality play, The History of the Rise, Progress, and Accomplishment of the Abolition of the African Slave Trade by the British Parliament. The history of this immortal war, which Coleridge compared to the mean conquests, quote unquote, of Napoleon, demonstrated the irrelevancy of abstract disputes over theology or ethical systems. It also resolved all the ambiguities of moral judgment. The noblest historical achievement of Christianity had also been an infallible test that separated the sheep from the goats, as if, Clarkson wrote, they had been marked by the divine being at the day of judgment. The cause had unmasked the vicious who pretended to virtue, and had distinguished the moral statesmen from the self-serving politicians. The purpose of the history, according to Clarkson, was to provide readers with an informed appreciation of the joy and gratitude they ought to feel when contemplating Britain's most selfless act. The moral of the let me try that again. The moral of the tale was essentially twofold. No good efforts are ever lost, since Providence brings about an extraordinary concurrence of means and circumstances that could neither be foreseen nor contrived. Second, a virtuous cause unites men of all faiths and persuasions, together with men of the humblest and most exalted ranks. The list of progenitors and coadjutors, sorry, uh, per, uh, wow, let me try that again. The lists of progenitors and coadjutors furnished a new cast of saints and heroes. William Dillwyn rightly predicted that Clarkson's history would offer an opportunity to exhibit, quote, a practical comment on the principles of Quakerism, end quote. Bishop Porteous recalled with pride that it had been the grandson of an archbishop, Sharp, who had first drawn the public's attention to the iniquities of slavery and the slave trade. Ramsay, an Anglican clergyman, had been the cause's first martyr. An appreciation of the origins and continuity of the anti-slavery history secured the reputation of Sharp, who, as an aging philanthropist, was becoming increasingly obsessed with apocalyptic fantasies of quote the Black Power and the seven-horned beast, end quote. Soon after his death, in 1813, Sharp was canonized as the first anti-slavery saint. A monument erected in Westminster Abbey by the African Institution eulogized him as a, quote, model of disinterested virtue, end quote. Although Clarkson would be the favorite symbol of abolitionism for poets and liberal reformers, it was Wilberforce who was hailed as God's instrument for preserving the lives of millions, and Wilberforce who was imagined to experience an inward satisfaction that exceeded the temporal rewards of any man in history. In the Age of Revolution, Wilberforce was England's answer to the illustrious Washington, who was, after all, a slaveholder. Far more to the point, and the comparison hardly needed elaboration, in Romilly's eloquent tribute before the House of Commons, Wilberforce was England's answer to the, quote, common enemy of mankind, end quote, who was enslaving Europe while Wilberforce was securing, quote, a Magna Carta for Africa, end quote. The victory inevitably enhanced Britain's self-image at a moment when, as William Allen noted, quote, the continent of Europe seems completely at his, Napoleon's, feet, and America is highly inflamed against us, end quote. Clarkson spoke for more than the abolitionist community when he wrote, quote, nor is it a matter of less pleasing consideration that, at this awful crisis, when the constitutions of kingdoms are on the point of dissolution, the stain of the blood Africa is no longer upon us, or that we have been freed, alas, if it be not too late, from a load of guilt which was hung like a millstone about our necks, ready to sink us to perdition. End quote. In 1807, British morale was in need of elevation, and it is understandable that relief from guilt should have been accompanied by extravagant self-congratulation. In the eyes of the Duke of Norfolk, the abolition law was, quote, the most humane and merciful act which was ever passed by any legislature in the world, end quote. It was no coincidence, he suggested, that the final achievement occurred in Passion Week, when the Son of God displayed, quote, that stupendous instance of mercy towards mankind, the redemption of the world by his death upon the cross, end quote. Later skeptics, especially those living across the Channel, concluded that Britain's regeneration had been too sudden. During the first quarter century of anti-slavery agitation, Britain's share of the slave trade had increased to a virtual monopoly. To expect moral credit from limiting and then ending an escalating trade was rather like expecting moral credit from limiting or ending unilateral bombing raids. The point applies to the suffering already caused, not to the expected risks of cessation. On the other hand, not every government guilty of ghastly oppression has undergone, for whatever reasons, a change of heart, and from the best modern estimates it would appear that the British Abolition Act was not ineffective in reducing the number of slaves transported to the New World. Although it would require more than half a century of bribes, diplomacy, and coercion for England to realize her objective, the Act of 1807 also served as a symbolic precedent that gave courage and sanction to generations of reformers in the United States, France, and Brazil. For Englishmen, the precedent was all the more meaningful because it had occurred at a time of war and political reaction. Anti-slavery, at least in its preparatory stage of stopping the African trade, could not be stigmatized as the aberration of a radical era. In some ways, the Abolition Act did signify a radical and fundamental shift in colonial policy, a shift associated, for example, with Stephen's administrative reforms, with his plan for using the Crown Colony of Trinidad as a model for experiments in free labor, and with his later registration scheme. But these moves towards social engineering carried the protective coloration of evangelical religion. The Abolition Act was interpreted, above all, as a triumph of Protestant Christianity and as a moral vindication of the Church of England, and since the cause after 1807 carried the aura of respectable religion in a way that contrasted sharply with anti-slavery in the United States, it could serve as a safe vehicle for mobilizing massive public support. In 1814, for example, English leaders were happy to demonstrate to the courts of Europe that the English people, with a single voice, demanded the international suppression of the slave trade. The voice was predominantly middle class in tone, and to the ears of radicals like Cobbett, seemed directly antithetical to the English working class. Yet there is evidence, especially by the 1820s, that abolitionism had filtered down to working men who attended dissenting congregations or the various societies for moral improvement and useful knowledge. It could serve both as an instrument and symbol of upward mobility, or even provide an organizational model for more radical causes. The West Indian planters who were still living in the 18th century world had little comprehension of the changes taking place in English society. When they harassed and persecuted nonconformist missionaries, expecting the wild enthusiastics would receive little support from home, they sealed their fate. The social transformations of the first 2 decades of the 19th century made it certain that any attempt to keep the gospel from slaves would succeed in turning the vast indignation of English descent into channels of protest that had won official sanction. The significance of this fact can be underscored by a brief comparison with the United States, where the governing elites had failed to win such national hegemony, and there and were there and where there was far less religious cleavage between slaveholding and free labor cultures. Methodists and Baptists scored great successes in the South precisely because they absorbed and reflected the social norms of the Southern community. As a result, the national churches tried to accommodate policy to the diverse values of their constituents, and the mediating role of the church meant quite literally that abolitionists would either have to come out from the churches or split the churches apart. Yet in England, by the 1820s, a defense of the missionaries and a humbling of the godless planters could unite dissenters and many Anglicans in a great crusading cause. Excuse me. The domestic implications of the Abolition Act were somewhat subtler. Stephen and other abolitionists had converted an attack on West Indian slavery into a vindication of the existing social order. This theme ran through the parliamentary debates of 1807. For example, Walter Fox, a new member from Yorkshire, said there was no need to discuss the Commons any further with tales of quote unquote floating dungeons or of the inhuman separation of slave families. What outraged Fox was the claim that the West Indian slave would prefer his situation to that of an English peasant. He asked for proof that the slave enjoyed the option of exchanging, quote, the niggardly and parsimonious employer for the open and generous master, and that he is animated with that proud feeling of country which pervades every British bosom, from the lowest to the highest class of our community. End quote. Yorkshire in the previous year had been seething with discontent. A parliamentary committee on the woolen trade had just called for the suppression of the croppers' organization, whose petitions were seen as evidence of J- J- I just still don't know how to pronounce this, Jacobin conspiracy, and the quote the proud feeling of country end quote was being turned by despair into the violent protest of Luddism. The humanitarian triumph of 1807 coincided roughly with the removal of much of the legislation that had protected the traditional customs of trade and the restrictive practices of English workers. By 1809, according to E.P. Thompson, quote, all the protective legislation in the woolen industry covering apprenticeship, the gig mill, and the number of looms was repealed. The road was now open for the factory, the gig mill, the shearing frame, the employment of unskilled and juvenile labor. End quote. Clearly, there was no causal connection between the two forms of abolition, although the abolition of the slave trade helped to reinforce the image of England as a land of freedom where proud workers could easily exchange the niggardly employer for the open and generous master. Yet the unrelated acts of abolition did reflect an emerging frame of mind, for it appeared that neither the West Indian planters nor the English workers understood their own true interests. Both groups clung blindly to archaic methods of production, resisting such tools of progress as plows and shearing frames, and issuing portentous warnings that violence and economic ruin would result from any tampering with their obsolete ways. It was necessary, therefore, to apply a negative pressure that would force planters and workers to identify their own interests with those of the nation, as redefined by an emerging hegemony of capitalists and evangelical reformers. By removing various privileges, monopolies, and protective rules, legislators could at once encourage individual responsibility, strike a blow against slavery, and help to create an undifferentiated labor force as a prime national resource. How could one later question a cause that had found confirmation in the ancient British Constitution, that had won support from the great orators of all parties, and that had finally triumphed in the House of Lords? Regardless of domestic turbulence and scandal, of public doubts and prophecies of doom, England had begun the 19th century with an act of sublime nobility. The philanthropists, nobles, peers, and clergy who joined in 1807 to form the African Institution tried, quite literally, to institutionalize that transcendent impulse to make it a permanent part of national life. Their efforts to redeem Africa, to spread the blessing of British liberty, and to prepare the West Indian slave for ultimate freedom were supported, in the words of the evangelical organ, by the, quote, spontaneous sentiments of every Christian, end quote. And for generations to come, the crusade against slavery and the slave trade would be hailed as unanswerable proof that English humanitarianism outweighed English avarice and class interest. In the famous verdict of W.E.H. Lecky, quote, the unwearied, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous acts recorded in the history of nations. End quote. The slave system as a mirror for English society. The early anti-slavery literature shows less concern over arbitrary power per se than over arbitrary power divorced from traditional sanction. It was not simply that the slave owner's, quote, power constitutes right, end quote, as James Ramsay said, but that both power and right had been purchased. And what could one say, as Wilberforce asked the House of Commons, of a system that gave such power to any man who could scrape together 40 pounds? Virtually any man who could afford a horse in England, Wilberforce said, could afford a slave in the West Indies. Masters included men of all ranks, understandings, and tempers, including, no doubt, the most ignorant and worthless. Oh, that was the end of the sentence. In 1784, Ramsay had reported, quote, Slaves chiefly suffer where they are the property of an ignorant, low-minded, narrow-hearted wretch, or of one indignant and involved, or of a man who makes a figure beyond his income in England, or when they are submitted to some raw lad or untaught, unfeeling manager or overseer. Because this, end quote. Because the slave system appeared to be dominated by an unmitigated drive for wealth, it could symbolize all the forces that threatened to unravel the fabric of traditional deference, patronage, and hereditary status. I'm going to pause there for just a second and stand up. I'm being really fidgety tonight because I don't know, I'm kind of sleepy right now. So I'm going to do a little stance work here. Get my blood pumping a little bit. Okay. Englishmen were acutely sensitive to such dangers precisely because English society had long been in the vanguard of the march of Western capitalism. It was becoming increasingly clear by the second half of the 18th century that commercial wealth could provide men with access to social rank and public office. Defenders of the old order, who usually represented earlier stages of commercial success, charged that the purchase of titles or landed estates undermined public respect for authority. Burke complained that the Nabob, that's Nabob, adventurers who had reaped wealth in India were inclined to become Jacobins. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's Jacobins. It's always capitalized. Jacobins. I don't know. Since they resented the discovery that there were things money could not buy. Although the West Indies were only one source of nouveau riches, popular imagery linked the region with easy money and conspicuous consumption. Richard Paris, or Richard Pears, I'm not sure how that one is said either, has called attention to the lack of financial independence of English gentlemen and the younger sons of noblemen who were forced to look to government patronage as the source of wealth. Quote, almost the only rich businessmen with stable fortunes which would look after themselves were the absentee sugar planters, a fact which goes some way to explain why a somewhat disproportionate number of them sat in the House. End quote. Such absentee planters were not necessarily self-made men, and West Indian fortunes were easily assimilated into English society. Yet in the Thomas Day's immensely popular children's book Sanford and Merton, it seemed only natural that a small boy from Jamaica should be a spoiled brat. The author, who had previously won acclaim for his long poem The Dying Negro, also presents Tommy Merton as a little tyrant, arrogant and yet soft. His family lives in ostentatious luxury. The moral of the tale involves Tommy's redemption at the hands of a simple farmer's son and a masculine clergyman who teach him the value of hard work and ascetic self-denial. Few Englishmen, no doubt, were prepared to renounce an important source of national wealth or to curtail the privileges that wealth entailed. But in a vague way, America, and especially the West Indies, could be identified as a source of avarice and corruption. This is not to say that British attacks on American slaveholding were merely a projection of domestic needs and fears. The evils of Negro slavery were no illusion, nor was it unrealistic for Englishmen to see in the slaves' colonies a paradigm of those forces of plutocracy and unrestrained plutocracy, and unrestrained self interest which threatened the ordered liberties of the past. Clearly, the rise of anti-slavery sentiment represented a major advance in the moral consciousness of mankind. The abolitionists were among the first protesters to recognize a form of class and institutional exploitation, independent of individual goodwill. To accuse the government of complicity is in such exploitation, and to acknowledge the collective responsibility of all consumers whose luxuries required such heavy human cost. The need to idealize a tradition of domestic liberty may have made it easier to perceive American slavery as a lawless innovation, but it is also probable that the anti-slavery experience ultimately taught many Englishmen to recognize forms of systematic oppression that were closer to home. Yet perceptions of oppression often rest on a screening out of subtler species of oppression. As Marx said of an earlier reformer, in words that later critics would adapt to Marx himself, quote, Luther vanquished servility based upon devotion because he replaced it by servility based upon conviction. He emancipated the body from chains because he laid chains upon the heart. End quote. I have previously suggested that British anti-slavery literature mirrored the needs and tensions of a society increasingly absorbed with problems of underemployment and labor discipline. This argument must be developed with considerable care and qualification in order to avoid the simplistic impression that industrialists promoted abolitionist doctrine as a means of distracting attention from their own forms of exploitation. The early British industrialists saw their own innovations as unmistakable agencies of moral progress and human betterment. More to the point, industrialization was only a nascent force during the first decades of the abolitionist movement. On the other hand, British abolitionism coincided with the emerging ideology and societal circumstances which made industrialization possible. The abolitionist movement cannot be detached from its defining social context, from the accelerating pace of enclosures, which augmented a drifting population of rural paupers, from the problem of disposing of convicts who could no longer be shipped to America, from the trade and pauper apprentices who were being sent by the wagon or barge load from London to the mill towns, from the growing desire for utility, efficiency, productivity, and order, or from the industrial employment of small children, which to the generation of the 1790s, as J.R. Poynter has observed, seemed almost a panacea. If British abolitionists could express horror over the iron chains of the slave trade, their acts of selectivity and definition helped to strengthen the invisible chains being forged at home. Ooh. I was in holding that horse stance for quite a while. It was pretty good. Let my legs rest for a minute. Accusations of wait a minute. Did I read that already? Invisible chains forged at home. Okay. Accusations of inconsistency or hypocrisy can only obscure the complex relationship between West Indian slavery and the more progressive thought of early industrial England. As reformers grappled with the problems of crime, pauperism, and labor discipline, they seemed to be unconsciously haunted by the image of the slave plantation. Thus, Bentham's vision of the model prison, proposed in 1784 as an alternative to deportation to Australia, is a virtual caricature of the planter's ideal. Quote, if it were possible to find a method of becoming master of everything which might happen to a certain number of men, to dispose of everything around them so as to produce on them the desired impression, to make certain of their actions, of their connections, and of all the circumstances of their lives, so that nothing could escape nor could oppose the desired effect, it cannot be doubted that a method of this kind would be a very powerful and a very useful instrument, which governments might apply to various objects of the utmost importance, end quote. Among the various objects for which Bentham recommended his method were hospitals, schools, madhouses, and factories. During the 1790s, when British reformers, including Bentham, were condemning the dehumanization of West Indian slavery, the great utilitarians circulated grandiose plans for the rational reconstruction, rational restructuring of English society. The domestic labor problem could be solved, Bentham argued, by building hundreds of great quote unquote houses of industry, modeled on the panopticon principles of central surveillance, regimentation, and division of labor. Each house would be managed by a governor and governess, assisted by various foremen and forewomen, a chaplain, a bailiff, a medical curator, a matron midwife, a schoolmaster, and an organist clerk. The list reads like a parody of contemporary proposals for reforming the plantation system. The parallel extends to Bentham's ingenious means of guaranteeing a place for each worker without resorting to the inequitable burdens of the poor laws and the laws of settlement. Quote, but if all infants were branded painlessly and indelibly with name, place, and date of birth, identification for settlement, and a host of other useful purposes would be instantaneous, end quote. Each house would be totally self-supporting as a result of maximizing the output of each worker, including small children. It would be essential, Bentham pointed out, to calculate the net value of children in every age group. Quote, was the average child, he asked in a question that was still disputed in the West Indies, worth more or less than nothing, end quote. It is possible to dismiss Bentham's program as the fantasy of an eccentric reformer, though there is still debate over his influence as the creator of an appealing social ideal. If the government failed to construct a network of panopticons, it did erect the new Union Workhouse, which Poynter aptly describes as, quote, a fortress protecting society from two quite different evils, the starvation and insurrection of unrelieved indigence on the one hand, and the moral depravity and economic ruin of progressively increasing pauperism on the other, end quote. The significant point, however, is that Bentham's vision of rational progress suggests an ambivalent response to plantation slavery, a response that embodied in turn some of the central contradictions of English society. In one respect, Bentham's proposals were consistent with the principles of laissez-faire. Even the panopticon prisons would be run without burden to the taxpayer. The government would simply contract with an entrepreneur who, quote, takes charge of the convicts at so much a head and applies their time and industry to his personal profit, as does a master with his apprentices, end quote. The entrepreneur's duties toward his charges would be, quote, so bound up with his interest that he would be forced to do for his own advantage anything that he was not inclined to do for theirs, end quote. A system of life insurance, for example, could guarantee that the entrepreneur's profits would decrease if there were a rise in the average rate of mortality. Presumably, the same effect could be more easily achieved by converting the convicts into personal property, but this solution would contradict the assumption or pretense that both entrepreneur and worker were economic men, quote unquote, in a world of harmonious interests. In point of fact, there is a striking discrepancy between Bentham's competitive model based on individual self-interest and his obsessive concern for social discipline. The same discrepancy is evident in the ideology of the early industrialists, whose ideal of free market conditions gave no justification for attempts to control the behavior and leisure time of their workers. In theory, after all, an employer of free workers, unlike a slave owner, should be interested only in purchasing equal units of labor at the cheapest possible price. Yet entrepreneurs like Richard Arkwright and Josiah Wedgwood had already made practical application of a principle recommended by Bentham. Quote, to be incessantly under the eyes of the inspector is to lose, in effect, the power to do evil and almost the thought of wanting to do it. End quote. Bentham gave the game away not only by proposing a model of prison discipline for schools and factories, but by appealing to the standard of relative happiness. Call them soldiers, quote, call them soldiers, call them monks, call them machines, so they were but happy ones, I should not care, end quote. Okay, I'm going to have to stand up again. I don't know why I'm so droopy tonight, but it's given me a lot of good chance to do some stance work, which is good. I need to do it. The alleged happiness of Negro slaves was, of course, a central argument of American planters, and the alleged happiness of English workers justified new forms of dependence and control that also gave entrepreneurs an exalted role in the production process. While English society increasingly condemned the institution of slavery, it approved experiments in labor discipline which appeared to gravitate toward the plantation model. Paradoxically, planters, especially those in the United States, increasingly followed the industrialists' lead in using incentives to manipulate slave behavior without fearing, it should be added, that such amelioration would be a step toward eventual emancipation. Slaveholders and industrialists shared a growing interest not only in surveillance and control, but in modifying the character and habits of their workers. Long before anyone had dreamed of founding an anti-slavery society, Daniel Defoe had complained that, quote, there is nothing more frequent than for Englishmen to work till he has got his pockets full of money and then go and be idle or perhaps drunk till 'tis all gone, end quote. As early manufacturers soon discovered, the English worker also had a fondness for communal feast days, drunken wakes, and the recuperation of Saint Monday, quote unquote. By the 1780s, such habits were no longer tolerable to progressive industrialists. The new generation of entrepreneurs was also discontented over the laxness of the putting out system, in which a demand for labor could result in higher wages, and higher wages could result in more frequent vacations. As Stephen A. Marglin has pointed out, it was not technology that led irresistibly to the creation of a concentrated and dependent force of wage laborers. In many industries, at least, it was the entrepreneur's new social and managerial role that required continuous supervision of employees and control over the proportions of their work and leisure time. There was a surface resemblance, to say the least, between the innovations of the new model factories and the contemporary abolitionist portrait of the sugar plantation. James Ramsay, for example, might also have been describing pre-industrial England when he wrote, quote, formerly, before we became such accurate planters, and before luxury had rapaciously converted every little nook of land into sugar, the slaves had a field or two of the fallow cane land yearly divided among them, for a crop of yams, peas, and potatoes, and a field of the best cane land was annually put in yams to be reserved for their weekly allowance. End quote. When the planters became accurate, they subordinated every human concern to the single goal of production. At 4 in the morning, a bell called the slaves to the fields or sugar mill, where they worked under close supervision without rest or moments of leisure until dark. Ramsay's words called Josiah Wedgwood's famed er, Ramsay's words recall Josiah Wedgwood's famed Etruria mill. An ardent abolitionist, Wedgwood was also an accurate and autocratic master. A warning bell summoned his employees at 5:45 or 1/4 hour before the men and girl apprentices could see to work. They then toiled until dark under the constant surveillance of overseers and inspectors. The later perfected means for eliminating waste or moments of idleness. The mill hands had, of course, lost all control over the tools of their trade, as well as any claim to free time or space for the cultivation of yams, peas, and potatoes. The use of child labor meant that factory managers displaced parents as the dominant authorities. This was one of the evils of West Indian slavery, which aroused the most indignant protest. Like West Indian slaves, Wedgwood's workers resisted the growing pressure for maximized production. But in addition to the threat of blacklisting, they faced grave risks if they contemplated emigrating from the country. In 1783, a riot brought on by a shortage of wheat was crushed by military force. One worker was hanged. Wedgwood's campaign for industrial discipline, cushioned by a benevolent paternalism, drew invaluable support from evangelical reformers like William Wilberforce. The latter, as Elie Helevy has written, quote, was at once the mouthpiece of the party of order and of the business world, end quote. In his concern for order, Wilberforce combined a nostalgia for the past with a genuine interest in the material and moral well-being of workers. In towns like Sheffield and Manchester, for example, he was distressed to find that apprentices no longer lived with their masters as part of an extended family. The masters' wives thought themselves too elegant to carry such responsibility. But whatever the causes, Wilberforce knew that the social order was changing and that substitutes would have to be found for the watchful eye of paternalistic masters. It was his plan in 1787 which resulted in the royal proclamation against vice and immorality, and in a special society designed to suppress blasphemy, drunkenness, indecent publications, Sabbath breaking among the poor, village wakes and festivals, and unlicensed places of public amusement. According to Neil McKendrick, even Josiah Wedgwood had been powerless to prevent the work stoppage caused by summer wakes and fairs. Quote, it was only slowly that the passion for wakes died, strangled by the joint efforts of the manufacturers, the Methodists, and the Society for the Suppression of Vice, end quote. The disciplinarians, quote unquote, in E.P. Thompson's words, quote, won the battle of the Industrial Revolution, end quote. Wilberforce's concerns focused on social order and virtue, not on the Industrial Revolution. Yet his aid to manufacturers was not limited to his leadership in reform movements that helped to destroy pre-industrial culture and to create a responsible, predictable, and manipulatable labor force. In 1795, Wilberforce won a major political triumph again in the cause of order when he persuaded an immense public meeting in Yorkshire to support Pitt's Sedition Act, which he himself had helped to broaden and which had aroused storms of protests throughout the land. In 1799, it was Wilberforce who first proposed to Parliament a general combination law which prohibited workers in any trade from combining to protect their interests, which denied the accused a jury trial in which, in the words of Wilberforce's sympathetic biographer, quote, killed trade unionism for a quarter of a century, end quote. In 1817, Wilberforce was a member of the secret committee of the House of Commons, investigating domestic dissent, championing a new seditious meetings bill, and approving in 1818 the suspension of habeas corpus. The suspension bill promoted Sir Francis Burdett to ask, prompted, I don't know where I got promoted from that. The suspension bill prompted Sir Francis Burdett to ask why Wilberforce should be shocked by African enslavement and not shocked by a law that would allow Englishmen to be seized and treated like African slaves. There would, however, be no reason to admire Wilberforce more if he had consistently supported regressive regimes in both England and the West Indies. The central question involves the relationship between anti-slavery values and the forces that were shaping a new English working class. If any abolitionists were unaware of the condition of English laborers or were blind to the parallels with their own indictments of slavery, they had only to read the tracts of their West Indian opponents. As early as 1772, the Scots Magazine reprinted, along with a laudatory review of Anthony Benezet, an essay from a London paper comparing the condition of West Indian slaves to that of English common laborers, who were, quote, more real slaves to necessity than to Egyptian taskmasters, for necessity makes no allowance for sickness, but suffers the sick laborer's wife and children to starve. End quote. At least the children of slaves did not fall victim to, quote, unfeeling parish overseers who had no private interest in their preservation. End quote. To be sure, the English workers were free. They could boast of, quote, the liberty of changing their masters for the same wages, a mighty boast indeed to change their masters for the worse, while they still remain slaves to the necessity of constant and hard labor. End quote. In 1789, Gilbert Franklin could point to the more specific consequences of the early Industrial Revolution. Quote, sure I am that the laborer in England, who is the slave of necessity, serves a harder taskmaster than the African finds in the West Indies. No severities there exercised are equal to the cruelty of enticing poor people to a small addition of wages to work in lead, quicksilver, or other metals, or deleterious manufactories, which in a very few months or years render the life of the poor victim an unremitting scene of torture and misery which death alone can relieve him from. End quote. Of course, Franklin drew a preposterously idyllic picture of West Indian slavery, but his response to Clarkson's celebrated prize essay won at Cambridge was more on the mark. Why, Franklin asked, did the two great universities not offer prizes, quote, for the best dissertation on the evil effects which the manufacturers of Birmingham, Manchester, and other great manufacturing towns produce on the health and the lives of the poor people employed therein? End quote. Suppose such a contest uncovered the talents of a Clarkson. Quote, what horror might not an ingenious man excite in the mind of his reader in describing 2,000 or 3,000 fine rosy-cheeked children playing in the meads enameled with flowers, in all the luxuriance of health and happiness, seized on by those baneful friends, avarice and luxury, and placed together in the hot rooms of different manufactories, till the pestilential vapor repeatedly inhaled spreads contagion amongst them. End quote. Note that Franklin found it necessary to anthropomorphize avarice and luxury as friends which seized the rosy-cheeked children and placed them together in the noxious mills. In the abolitionist view, the recruitment and discipline of a slave labor force depended entirely on physical coercion. Obviously, the lash was not unique to the slave plantation, nor were whippings unfamiliar to English children, wives, apprentices, sailors, or lawbreakers. The 6 or 7 year old pauper children in the textile mills knew the meaning of the foreman's strap, or worse still, of the billy roller grabbed from a spinning machine. Yet sensitivities had changed in England and even in the Caribbean since the days of cropped ears, bored tongues, and severed bodies. Bentham was not alone in desiring a system of rational punishments that would inflict precisely measured pain, and at a time when English industrialists were devising ingenious and more efficient subtle substitutes for physical punishment, the slave system could symbolize a discredited form of authority that seemed to require the personal imposition of continuous pain. James Stephen thought it difficult thought it James Stephen thought it sufficient to present a matter-of-fact description of plantation driving system without involving himself in moral judgments. As an experienced witness, he told how slaves prepared the soil for sugarcane plants, turning up ground with hoes in long parallel trenches. Blacks of both sexes would be drawn out in line like troops on parade, and the drivers were required to keep the lines dressed and moving at equal speed. If one slave hoed slower than the rest, those behind him in line would have to halt work. Only the constant use of a cart whip could ensure that no time would be wasted and that the lines would move without interruption. Aside from the regimentation of labor, there were crucial differences between the sugar plantation and Wedgwood's Etruria mill, which Edward Radcliffe described as that paradise, quote unquote. Wedgwood himself personified the Protestant ethic and worked as strenuously as his employees. He waged unremitting war on dirt, carelessness, and waste of any kind. It was not the cart whip, but incentive that governed his factory discipline. His goal and methods conformed to what recent psychologists have rediscovered as quote unquote behavior modification before positive and negative reinforcement, or through positive and negative reinforcement. I don't know where I got before. To his foreman, Wedgwood issued written rules and instructions describing the common tricks and evasions of workers. He precisely specified the proper methods of approval and reprimand. When workers arrived in the morning, the quote clerk of the manufactory end quote let them know their punctuality was on record. Wedgwood also devised that McKendrick terms quote a primitive clocking in system end quote, using tickets to record the exact times of arrival and departure. It was significant that Wedgwood's bell rang on the quarter hour. The entire factory was synchronized to the clock. Higher wages rewarded superior skill and regularity. Infractions of the rules brought heavy fines. Like most men of their time, abolitionists refused to accept Franklin's argument that workers could be slaves of necessity. Stephen drew the distinction that then seemed self-evident. Quote, look at the most laborious peasant in Europe, and if you please, the most oppressed. He is toiling, it is true, from painful necessity, but it is necessity of a moral kind acting upon his rational nature, and from which brutal coercion differs as widely as a nauseous drench in the mouth of an infant from the medicated milk of his mother. End quote. The imagery is suggestive. The fear of physical punishment is brutalizing and is as naturally repellent to men as a violent cathartic. But the fear of hunger, prison, or unemployment acts upon man's rational nature, quote unquote. When coupled with the hope of reward, such fears are a wholesome inducement to labor. Wages suggest the nourishment of a mother's breast. Stephan goes on to compare the Negro slave to a rickety infant whose muscles of voluntary motion have become contracted by unnatural restraint. Just as the infant must be carefully taught to walk, so the slave must gradually learn to work from motives other than blind obedience. Presumably, Stephan has in mind, quote, necessity of a moral kind, end quote, since he affirms that man is naturally indolent and can only be taught to labor voluntarily as his mind acquires foresight. I think we're almost... Okay, good. Yep, we are very nearly done. The rise of anti-slavery sentiment in Britain coincided with an with an urgent domestic problem of labor discipline and labor management. If abolitionists agreed on the necessity of maintaining order and reforming the manners and habits of the working class, they clearly felt some ambivalence, along with many of their countrymen, toward the changes accompanying early industrialization. The immediate problem did not concern an industrial proletariat, but rather an immense rural labor force that had been uprooted, released from traditional restraints and controls, but not yet deprived of the independence of pre-industrial village culture. Because the slave system was both distinctive and remote, it could become a subject for experimental fantasies that assimilated traditional values to new economic needs. An attack on the African slave trade could absorb some of the traditionalists' anxieties over the physical uprooting and dislocation of labor. The victims of enclosure were at least not marched in chains to the slave ships, or shipped abroad to unfeeling masters, but picturing the slave plantation as totally dependent upon physical torture, abolitionist writers gave sanction to less barbarous modes of social discipline. For reformers, the plantation offered the prospect of combining the virtues of the old agrarian order with the new ideals of uplift and engineered incentive. Abolitionists could contemplate a revolutionary change in status precisely because they were not considering the upward mobility of workers, but rather the rise of distant Negroes to the level of humanity. They could stress the Negro's capacity for a freer and better life because such a life depended on an internalized sense of duty. They could repudiate the authority derived from a form of property ownership, but in so doing help to redefine the obligations, or lack of obligations, of legitimate ownership. British anti-slavery provided a bridge between pre-industrial and industrial values. By combining the ideal of emancipation with an insistence on duty and subordination, it helped to smooth the way to the future. Yet the paradigm of slavery and anti-slavery also suggested a future of a different kind. Although the abolitionist movement helped to clear an ideological path for British industrialists, it also bred a new sensitivity to social oppression. The concept of slavery is both evocative and elastic. No one sought to prove the debasement of the Negro slave by likening his condition to that of the English worker. When radicals like Cobbett and West Indian apologists like Franklin tried to divert attention to the plight of English laborers, they automatically talked of slaves and masters. They claimed to be the true abolitionists, exposing the conflict and oppression masked by a spurious harmony of interests. The metaphors amounted to more than verbal play, since they expanded on the moral vision of the initial abolitionists. When Friedrich Engels later wrote his masterful study of the condition of the working class in England, he echoed one of Cobbett's favorite themes. Quote, "A slave is at least assured of his daily bread by the self-interest of his master, while the serf at any rate has a piece of land on the produce of which he can live. The proletarian, on the other hand, is thrown wholly upon his own resources, and yet at the same time is placed in such a position that he cannot be sure that he can always use those resources to gain a livelihood for himself and his family. Everything that the factory worker can do to try and improve his position vanishes like a drop in the bucket in face of the flood of chance occurrences to which he is exposed and over which he has not the slightest control. End quote. Though Engels wanted to prove that the English factory worker was even more oppressed than the Negro slave, he relied on the conceptual framework of the abolitionists. Quote, the slavery which the middle classes have imposed on the workers can be seen most clearly in the factory system. There is law, and in fact the operative law loses all his rights. There, in law and in fact, the operative loses all his rights. End quote. The earlier anti-slavery literature had not only charged Engels' terms with moral resonance, but had provided a model for the systematic indictment of social crime. Without the debating questions of influence, it is not far-fetched to see the condition of the working class in England as one of the greatest of anti-slavery tracts. And that is the end of chapter 9. So, just out of curiosity, I'm going to look at how long chapter 10 is. Yeah. Well, I guess it's... Yeah, I'm going to have to split it in two in order to get through it. But that's all right. We'll do the first half of it on Friday. And yeah, that's the plan. So that's it for tonight. I will see you all in the next one. Have a good evening.